Welcome back to the deep dive. I want you to do something for me right now. Close your eyes for a second. Picture ancient India. Just, let the image form. What pops into your head?
Well, if I had to guess, I'd bet most people are seeing the Ganges River, maybe the burning ghats of Varanasi. Or if you know a little bit of history, you're picturing the Guptas in the north, or maybe you're stepping way ahead to the Taj Mahal or something.
Exactly. The mental map almost always defaults to the north. The Gangetic Plains. But today, we are aggressively shifting that map. We are ignoring the north entirely.
Right.
We are heading down to the Deccan Plateau and the Coromandel Coast.
Which is a shift that is so long overdue because, if you only focus on the north during the 6th to 9th centuries, you're staring at a fragmented mess after the fall of the Guptas. But if you look south, you're seeing the forge where Indian civilization was actually being hammered out into a new shape.
I was looking at the stack of notes he sent over, the inscriptions, the copper plates, the travelogues, and it reads like a multi-generational geopolitical thriller. This isn't just two neighboring kingdoms trading spices and playing nice.
No, not at all. We are talking about two massive imperial weights, the Chalukyas of Badami in the west, and the Pallavas of Kanchi in the east. And calling them rivals feels like a massive understatement.
It's a Game of Thrones situation, isn't it?
It really is. But imagine a Game of Thrones that lasts for 300 years. And instead of just destroying things, this constant war paradoxically creates some of the most beautiful art and I think the most resilient systems of administration in Indian history.
And that's the mission for this deep dive, right? We need to figure out how these two dynasties, locked in what seems like a death spiral of constant war, managed to build temples that are still standing 1,400 years later, and economic systems that look like, modern trust funds.
And to do that, we have to look at the hard evidence. We're going to read the propaganda carved into cliff faces. We're going to look at the notes of, what are essentially Chinese travelers? And we're even going to read the plays written by the kings themselves.
So let's set the board. We're starting with the Western power, the Chalukyas of Badami. Who are these people? Where do they come from?
Well, to understand the Chalukyas, you have to look at the power vacuum left by earlier dynasties. They rise to prominence around the mid-6th century. The founder is a man named Pulakeshin I. He ruled from roughly 543 to 566 AD.
And he wasn't just inheriting a throne, right? He effectively had to carve one out for himself.
Precisely. He declares independence from the Kadambas, who were the dominant regional power at the time. But Pulakeshin I didn't just, send a letter saying, I'm king now. He performed the Ashwamedha Yajna.
Okay, stop there. The Ashwamedha, the horse sacrifice. We hear this term a lot in Indian history, but what does it actually mean to a peasant in 550 AD? Why does killing a horse make you a king?
Right, so it's not just about the ritual itself. It's a geopolitical challenge. You take a prize horse, a stallion, and you let it roam free for a year, and you follow it with your army. Any territory the horse wanders into, you claim as yours.
That sounds incredibly provocative.
It is. That's the whole point. If a neighboring king lets the horse pass through his lands, he is tacitly admitting he is your subordinate.
Wow.
If he stops the horse, he has to fight your army. So when Pulakeshin I performs this, he isn't just praying, he is daring anyone in the Deccan to stop him.
So it's a power move. Come at me.
Exactly. It signals to everyone that a new sovereign power has arrived on the scene. His successor, Kirtivarman, then solidifies this by founding the capital at Badami, which is also known as Vatapi.
I looked up pictures of Badami. It's stunning. These massive red sandstone cliffs that just surround a lake.
It's a natural fortress. You've got the Agastya Lake there in the center, and these sheer cliffs on 3 sides. I mean, if you are a king looking for a place that says you can't touch me, Badami is it. Kirtivarman was the builder who really turned that geography into a capital.
But the real action, the moment the Chalukyas go from being a regional kingdom to a full-blown empire, happens with the next guy, Pulakeshin II.
Ah, the man, the myth. Pulakeshin II, who reigned from 609 to 642 AD, is one of those figures who just seems larger than life. But his start was not smooth. He didn't just inherit the crown, he had to fight a civil war for it.
Against his own uncle, right?
Yes, his uncle Mangalesha. It's the classic Hamlet problem, really. The uncle is supposed to be the regent because Pulakeshin was too young when his father died. But when the boy grows up, the uncle decides he likes the crown a little too much to give it back. He wants to pass it to his own son instead.
So Pulakeshin II has to conquer his own capital before he can conquer anyone else.
He essentially has to flee, gather an army of loyalists, and come back to defeat his uncle in battle. It was a really bloody start. But once he secures that throne, he goes on an absolute tear. And we know this because of one incredible document, the eye-hole inscription.
Okay, let's unpack the eye-hole inscription. I saw this mentioned repeatedly in the notes. Inscription sounds so dry, like a dusty museum label. But this is not a tax record.
No, it is definitely not a tax record. It's a prashasti. Think of it as a press release or a eulogy, but carved into stone so you can never, ever retract it. It was written by his court poet, a man named Ravikirti.
And Ravikirti wasn't humble. I read the translation. He ends the poem by saying, "I have now equaled the fame of Kalidasa." I mean, that's like a modern rapper saying, "I'm bigger than the Beatles."
That is exactly the vibe. He's a Jain scholar, incredibly learned, and he knows how to spin a narrative. He details Pulakeshin's victories over the Kadambas, the Gangas, and how the kings of Malwa and Kalinga submitted. But there is one victory in there that stands out above all the rest. The big one.
The defeat of Harsha.
The defeat of Harsha. This is the aha moment of the 7th century.
It really is. So up in the north, you had Harshavardhana, the great emperor of Kannauj. He was conquering everything in sight. He turns his eyes south, expecting to just sweep through the Deccan.
He brings this massive army elephants, cavalry, the works. He marches to the banks of the Narmada River.
And he expects to just roll right over them.
He expects the south to just crumble. But the Narmada isn't a stream. It's a major geographical barrier. Pulakeshin II uses the terrain, the river, and his own very formidable elephant corps to create a wall. And he stops Harsha cold.
And the eye-hole inscription has this beautiful, poetic line about Harsha, doesn't it?
It does. It plays on his name. The name Harsha means joy or happiness. The inscription says, Harsha, whose joy melted away in fear.
That is a sick burn to put in stone for eternity.
It is. But here is why we believe it. I mean, usually kings lie, propaganda is the norm. But we have a second independent source. Huan-Sang, the Chinese traveler.
It's a famous pilgrim.
Yes. And you have to remember, Huan-Sang was Harsha's guest. He loved Harsha. He spent years in his court. He was completely on Harsha's side.
Yeah.
And even he writes in his travelogue something to the effect of, the king of the north could not defeat the men of the Deccan. They are proud and free.
When the loser's best friend admits you won, you definitely won.
It marks a decisive moment. The North's advance was halted. After this, Pulakeshin II takes the title Parameshvar's Supreme Lord. He effectively drew a line in the sand, or rather in the water of the Narmada, that defined the political geography of India for a long time.
So he's at the absolute height of his power. He's the emperor of the south. But then hubris kicks in. He looks east.
He does. He decides to attack the Pallavas of Kanchi. And initially, he has some success. He pushes the Pallava king back to the very gates of Kanchi. But this aggression sparks a feud that eventually consumes him.
The tide turns.
It turns violently. The next Pallava king, a man named Narasimhavarman I, launches a massive counter-invasion. He marches all the way to Badami, the Chalukya capital. And in 642 AD, the great Pulakeshin II dies in battle, defending his own city against the Pallavas.
Talk about a dramatic fall. From defeating the emperor of the north to dying in your own capital at the hands of your southern rival.
It sets the stage for everything that follows. But before we get to the Pallava vengeance, we need to understand who these Pallavas actually were, because they're a very different kind of dynasty from the Chalukyas.
Right. Let's switch gears to the east coast, the Pallavas of Kanchi. The source material mentions there's a bit of a mystery, a debate about their origins.
There's a long-standing debate. Some early scholars thought the name Pallava might be a linguistic variant of Pallava, which would suggest a connection to the Parthians of Iran.
That would be a wild connection. Persian origins for a South Indian dynasty.
It would be, but modern scholarship has pretty much debunked that. The consensus now leans heavily toward a local origin. The name Pallava actually means creeper or sprout in Sanskrit.
Creeper, like a vine.
Yes, and that is a direct translation of the Tamil word Tundai. This connects them to the region of Tandimandalam, which is southern Andhra Pradesh and northern Tamil Nadu. It's known as the land of creepers.
Ah, okay.
So the theory is that they were originally a pastoral tribe from this region who rose to power. They weren't invaders, they were locals who made it big.
And just like the Chalukyas, they have a foundational figure who really sets the empire on its feet, Simhavishnu.
Simhavishnu, who is known as Avanisimha, or Lion of the Earth. He ruled in the late 6th century, and he's crucial because he defeated a group called the Kallavas.
The Kallavas are always described as this mysterious Dark Age dynasty.
Dark Age? Mostly because the later Brahminical sources didn't like them. They were patrons of Buddhism and Jainism and probably upset the traditional social order. Simhavishnu defeated them and firmly established Kanchi, or Kanchipuram, as the capital. He extended the Pallava Empire right down to the Kaveri River.
But the ruler who really catches my imagination is his son, Mahendravarman I. He sounds like such a character. His notes call him a Renaissance king.
That is a very fair description. Mahendravarman I, who ruled from about 590 to 630 AD, wasn't just a warrior. In fact, he might have preferred not to be a warrior at all. He was a poet, a musician, a dramatist.
He had some really interesting titles, didn't he?
He loved titles. He called himself Madhavilasa, which means drunk with joy, Vichitrachita, meaning curious mind, and Gunapara, the bearer of virtues.
Curious Mind is a fantastic title for a king. It suggests a real intellect, not just a brute.
And he proved it. He wrote a play that we still have today, a Sanskrit satire called the Madhavilasa Prahasanam.
A king writing satire. That's so rare. What is it about?
It's incredibly witty and surprisingly self-deprecating about the religious establishment of his time. It mocks the hypocrisy of Kapalika ascetics. Those are the guys who carry skulls as begging bowls, and Buddhist monks. The plot centers on a drunken Kapalika who loses his skull bowl and accuses a Buddhist monk of stealing it.
So the king is writing a comedy about drunken monks and skull-carrying ascetics? That's amazing.
Exactly. It shows a society that was robust enough to laugh at itself. This was a man of high culture, high intellect. But unfortunately for him, high intellect didn't stop Pulakeshin II's army.
Right, the war.
Mahendravarman lost the northern provinces to the Chalukyas. It was a huge humiliation. He had to retreat behind the walls of Kanchi. But he also underwent a significant personal transformation during his reign. He started out as a Jain, but under the influence of the Shaivite Senapar, he converted to Shaivism.
This religious shift seems to be a major theme. But let's talk about his son, because if the father was the curious mind, the son was the muscle. Narasimhavarman I, they called him Mahamalla.
The great wrestler. Narasimhavarman I, who ruled from 630 to 668 AD, was the Avenger. He inherited the war with the Chalukyas, but he was the one who finished it. He is the one who defeated Pulakeshin II.
This is the counter-invasion we mentioned.
Yes. He didn't just defend Kanchi, he took the fight to them. He marched his army all the way across the peninsula to Badami. He stormed their capital. He likely killed Pulakeshin II in that battle. And to make sure nobody missed the point, he took the title Vatapikonda.
The conqueror of Vatapi.
Imagine that scene, the Pallava army occupying the Chalukya capital. It was total, absolute victory. But Narasimhavarman wasn't just focused on the Chalukyas, he was a global player. He sent naval expeditions to Sri Lanka to help a claimant to the Sinhalese throne, a prince named Manavarma.
That implies a serious navy. You can't just float an army to Sri Lanka on rafts.
No, the Pallavas were a major maritime power. And of course, he is the primary builder behind Mamallapuram, or Mahabalipuram, which is named after him, Mamalla, the great wrestler.
We'll get to the architecture in a bit, but it's amazing to think that the Shore Temple and those famous rathas are linked to this specific wrestler king.
Indeed. The dynasty continued with other great rulers, like Narasimhavarman II, also known as Rajasimha. By his time, the intensity of the war had cooled down a little bit, which allowed him to focus almost entirely on art. He built the famous Kalasanatha Temple in Kanchi. He even sent an ambassador to China.
But eventually, all dynasties fade.
Yeah.
The notes mentioned the decline came from these continuous wars.
It's the classic trap. The wars with the Chalukyas just exhausted them, and then new powers emerged. The Rashtrakutas came up and replaced the Chalukyas, and then the Cholas began to rise in the south. Finally, around the late 9th century, the Chola king Aditya I defeated the last real Pallava ruler, Aparajita, and that was effectively the end of the dynasty.
So that's the political narrative, the Game of Thrones. But I want to pivot now to something that the notes highlight as a major strength of this era, governance. Because you don't build temples that last 1,400 years if your administration is a total mess.
You certainly don't. And the administration here is fascinating because it blends this high imperial structure with an incredibly robust local autonomy.
Let's look at the Chalukyas first. How did they run the show?
Their system was centralized, but also quite flexible. The king was the supreme head, obviously. They followed the traditional texts, the Dharmasastra, Nitisastra, but there's an interesting detail about succession.
Yeah, the notes say primogeniture, the eldest son automatically inheriting, wasn't strictly followed.
Not strictly, no. The eldest son was usually appointed Yuvaraja or heir apparent, but as we saw with Pulakeshin II fighting his uncle, ability and support often trumped birth order. But the real surprise in the Chalukya administration, and this is something that really stands out for the period, is the role of women.
This definitely stood out to me. We often assume ancient history is entirely male-dominated, but the Chalukyas had female provincial governors.
Yes. The sources are clear. They mention royal ladies, like a queen named Vijaya Patarika. She was a Chalukya queen who issued inscriptions in her own name.
And issuing an inscription is an act of sovereignty. That's not a small thing.
Exactly. It implies she wasn't just a figurehead. She held real executive power. She governed a province. This suggests a status for royal women in the Deccan that was perhaps significantly higher than in some contemporary northern kingdoms. We see mentions of them administering these large units.
That is fascinating. So you have a detailed hierarchy, Vishayapatis for districts, Samantas as feudal lords, but also this space for royal women to lead. Now, what about the Pallavas? Their administration seems a bit more bureaucratic.
The Pallavas were very fond of titles and structure. The king was the Maharajatiraja, the great king of kings. They had a complex ministry. They had amatyas who were counselors, mantrins who were diplomats. But there is one official that I absolutely love, the Raharikrita.
Rahastyakrita. That translates to private secretary, right?
Yeah.
But the root word, rahasya, means secret.
Exactly. The keeper of secrets, or the author of secrets. This was the confidential secretary who handled the king's private correspondence. It implies a level of statecraft where sensitive information really needed to be compartmentalized.
Like a proto-intelligence chief or a chief of staff?
Precisely. They also had a specialized treasury officer called the Manikapandaram Kapen.
That is a mouthful.
It is, but it shows specialization. They weren't just throwing all the money in one room. They had specific officers for specific assets, and their judicial system was structured too. They had courts called Adhikarna Mandapa, with fines graded by the level of the court Karanadandam for superior courts and Adhikarnadandam for district levels.
But the real jewel of the Pallava system, and this is something that seems to define South Indian history for centuries, is the village autonomy, the sabha.
This is crucial. If you want to know why South Indian society remains so resilient despite centuries of wars and changing dynasties, you have to look at the village. The Pallavas formalized the sabha.
Explain what the sabha actually did. Was it just like a town hall meeting where people aired grievances?
It was much, much more powerful than that. The sabha was the formal assembly in the Brahmadeya villages. Those were villages granted to Brahmins. There was also the urar for the regular villages. These bodies had real executive power. They managed land records. They handled local crime.
So if I stole a cow, the king in Kanchi doesn't judge me. The village sabha does.
Correct. And most importantly, they managed irrigation. They were the ones keeping the entire economy alive at the grassroots level.
This brings us perfectly to the economy, because you can't talk about South India without talking about water. The notes mention this concept called eripati.
Eripati. This is the secret sauce of South Indian civilization. I mean it.
Explain this to me like I'm 5, because it just sounds like tank land.
That's literally what it means. Okay, so picture the geography of the South. You don't have the Ganges. You don't have these massive snowmelt rivers flowing all year round. You have rain, monsoons. It pours for 3 months, and then it's bone dry for 9.
So if you don't capture that water, you starve.
Correct. So they build these massive tanks, we're talking huge man-made lakes, to store the monsoon water. But here's the problem. Physical infrastructure breaks down. Silt builds up in the tank. The bund, the wall, it cracks. Who pays to fix it?
Right. Usually you'd expect the king to pay. Or maybe you raise a special tax on the farmers.
But the king is far away fighting a war, and the farmers might be broke after a bad harvest. So the Pallavas and the local assemblies came up with this brilliant invention, the eripati. It's a specific plot of land. Let's say I'm a rich merchant and I want to do something good for my soul and my village. I donate this piece of land to the village assembly.
Okay.
But I attach a legal condition. The revenue from this land, the crops grown here, can never be touched for anything else. It is legally bound to the tank fund. It pays for the people who dredge the silt. It pays for the stonemasons who repair the walls.
So it's an endowment, it's a perpetual trust fund for a lake?
Precisely. And the village had a tank committee that was elected by the sabha that managed this whole system. They controlled the sluices, decided who got water when, and used the eripati money to keep the system running for centuries.
That is incredibly sophisticated. It decentralizes the survival of the village away from the state. Even if the king died or there was a war, the tank was still getting fixed.
Exactly. And that is why the South survived the collapse of dynasties so much better than other regions. The village didn't need the king to survive day to day.
So the economy was fundamentally agrarian, backed by this brilliant tank system. But it wasn't just farming. We had to talk about the traders, the guilds.
Oh, the guilds. This is where the story gets almost cinematic. We are talking about these powerful merchant corporations, groups like the Managram and most famously the Nanadesi.
And the Nanadesi.
Yeah.
These weren't just local shopkeepers.
No, Nanadesi literally means something like those from diverse countries or roaming traders. These guilds traded with Java, Sumatra, Cambodia, China. But here's the kicker. They were armed.
The notes mention vira sasanas.
Yes. Vira sasanas are heroic edicts. Usually, kings issue edicts. But here, the guilds themselves were issuing inscriptions detailing their own brave deeds, their own history, and their own military victories. They had their own flags, often featuring a bull.
Wait, hold on. So you have a corporation, essentially, that has its own army, its own flag, writes its own history, and operates across international borders.
That is exactly what it is.
That sounds wildly dangerous for a king. You have this armed, wealthy, independent body roaming through your kingdom.
It was a very delicate balance. The kings needed the guilds because they brought in immense wealth and, crucially, horses. Indian kings desperately needed good horses for their cavalry, and those had to be imported from Arabia or Central Asia. The guilds managed that entire supply chain, so the king tolerated their private armies because he needed their logistics and their money.
It's a truly globalized economy in the 8th century. We see direct trade with the Kamboja, which is Cambodia, and Champa, which is Vietnam.
And Mamallapuram was the hub. It wasn't just a place for pretty temples. It was a bustling international port connecting India to the rest of Southeast Asia.
Let's look at the software of this society, religion and culture. This period is described as a real melting pot.
It's a period of intense religious and cultural flux. At the start of our timeline, Jainism and Buddhism are still very, very strong in the South. But by the end, we see the massive, unstoppable rise of what we now call Hinduism, specifically the Bhakti movement.
We mentioned Mahendravarman converting from Jainism to Shaivism. Was that typical of a broader trend?
It was a trendsetter. The Bhakti movement was this grassroots devotional wave driven by the Nayanmars, who were devotees of Shiva, and the Alwars, devotees of Vishnu. They composed passionate poetry in the local language, Tamil.
This is the Thevaram and then later the Vyaprabhandam.
Yes. And this is crucial. Before this, high-level religious texts were mostly in Sanskrit or Pali, but the Nayanmars and Alwars sang in Tamil. They made religion accessible to the common man, to women, to everyone. You didn't need to be a scholar to understand God, you just needed to feel the devotion. This emotional, direct connection helped popularize Hinduism over the more austere intellectual traditions of Jainism and Buddhism.
But the Chalukyas seemed a bit more tolerant, or at least eclectic in their patronage.
The Chalukyas were very pragmatic. They were Vedic Hindus. They performed the Ashwamedha, but they patronized everyone. Ravikirti, the guy who wrote the Aihole inscription praising the king's military victories, was a devout Jain. There are beautiful Jain temples all over Aihole.
Whereas the Pallavas, after the conversion.
The Pallavas, particularly after Mahendravarman's conversion, became much more assertive in their Shaivite faith. There are accounts, perhaps exaggerated by later writers, but still telling of Mahendravarman destroying Jain monasteries. It was a very competitive religious marketplace.
And this brings us to this idea of the Aryanization of the South. The notes use this term. What does it actually imply in this context?
Right, it's a loaded term, so we should be precise. It refers to the increasing influence of northern cultural norms, primarily through the migration of Brahmin communities. The southern kings actively invited these Brahmin communities from the Gangetic Plains to settle in the south. They gave them land grants called Brahmadeya.
And with them came the Sanskrit language.
Yes. Sanskrit became the language of the court, of high culture, and of the royal prashastis. But, and this is so important, it didn't wipe out the local culture. It blended with it. You see these fascinating inscriptions where the eulogy part, praising the king, is in perfect Sanskrit, but the business details, the land boundaries, the taxes, the witness names, are in Tamil or Kannada. It became a bilingual, bicultural society.
And education shifted, too, from the Jain and Buddhist centers to these Brahmin-run Gatikas.
The Gatikas were essentially colleges attached to temples. Kanchi became a massive university town, a center of learning that some said rivaled Nalanda in the north. It was the premier center of Sanskrit learning. The founder of the Kadamas, Mayura Sharman, originally went to Kanchi just to study there.
Now, we absolutely cannot do a deep dive on the Chalukyas and Pallavas without visualizing their legacy, the art and architecture. This is stuff we can still see today.
This is their most visible and arguably most stunning legacy. The Chalukyas are often called the cradle of Indian temple architecture.
Why cradle? That implies they were birthing something totally new.
Because they were experimenting. If you go to Aihole today, it's like an open-air laboratory. You see dozens of temples, all in different styles. Some have flat roofs, some have curved towers or shikaras, some have barrel-vaulted roofs. It's like they were figuring out in real time. How do we transition from carving temples out of rock caves to building them from the ground up with stone?
They use that soft red sandstone, right?
Yes, the sandstone of the area is very easy to carve. They started with excavated caves at Badami, these spectacular shrines carved straight into the cliff face. But then at Patadakal, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site now, they built these massive freestanding structural temples like the Virupaksha temple. It's the mature phase of their style.
It's amazing to think of Aihole as a beta testing site for temples.
That's exactly what it was. And the Pallavas had a similar evolution, but they were working with granite, which is much, much harder to carve.
The Pallava evolution is described in 3 phases in the notes.
Right. So first, under Mahendravarman, you have these simple rock-cut mandapas, which are basically pillared halls. They're essentially caves dug into the faces of giant rocks.
Then comes a wrestler, Narasimhavarman.
And he creates the rathas at Mahabalipuram. These are the famous monolithic chariots. Now, monolithic is the key word here. They look like built temples, but they're not built. They are each carved out of a single giant boulder.
So he found a massive rock and just carved away everything that wasn't a temple.
Exactly. It's sculpture on an architectural scale. If you make a single mistake, you can't just replace the stone. The whole project is ruined. It's incredibly high-stakes art.
And finally, the 3rd phase.
Under Rajasima, they finally mastered building with stacked stone blocks. This is when you get the true structural temples, the iconic shore temple and the Kanchi Kailasanatha temple.
The shore temple, it's just iconic, standing right on the edge of the Bay of Bengal.
It has withstood the ocean winds and salt for 1,300 years. And what's significant is that these Pallava styles didn't just stay in India. They massively influenced the architecture of Southeast Asia. You can see clear echoes of the Pallava style in the temples of Cambodia and Java.
Before we wrap up, we have to acknowledge the contextual players. The notes mention the Ikshvakus and the Kadambas. They aren't the main characters in our story, but they matter.
They do. The Ikshvakus ruled in the Andhra region. They were the successors to the Satavahanas. They're interesting because they claimed this ancient mythical lineage, but were very likely a local tribe rising up. But the Kadambas of Banavasi are the real feisty ones.
Their origin story is fantastic. We touched on it briefly, but let's tell the full story. Marisharman.
Yes. So Marisharman was a Brahmin scholar. He goes to Kanchi to study at the famous Gatika there. He was a man of books, not swords. But the story goes that he was insulted by some Pallava officials or guards. Maybe they laughed at him or pushed him aside. Some kind of humiliation.
And he didn't take it well.
He took it very, very personally. Enraged, he swore to trade his begging bowl for a sword. He went into the deep forests of the Western Ghats, organized the local forest tribes, and launched a guerrilla war against the Pallava kingdom.
A scholar turned warlord out of spite.
Essentially. And he won. He defeated the Pallava armies sent against him and forced them to recognize him as a king. He founded the Kadamba dynasty. It just goes to show how fluid the social mobility could be. A Brahmin could become a king. A pastoral tribesman could become an emperor.
And the Kadambas eventually became feudatories to the Chalukyas, right?
Yes, but they remained a significant regional force, especially in maritime trade through ports like Banavasi and Bhatkal. They basically kept the west coast running.
So let's try and synthesize all this. We have the Chalukyas and the Pallavas. They fought for 300 years. They raided each other's capitals. But in that process, they built the template for South Indian culture.
They absolutely did. They established the administrative systems, like those autonomous village assemblies, that survived for a millennium. They created the architectural language, the Dravidian temple style that defines the South to this day. And they integrated the Deccan and the South into the wider world of Asian trade and culture.
It's the paradox we started with. Conflict breeds competition, and competition, in this case, bred incredible excellence.
And it shifted the center of gravity in India. After this period, you simply cannot write the history of India without giving equal weight to the South. It wasn't a periphery anymore. It was a core center of civilization.
Here's a thought to leave you with. We talked about those incredible trade guilds, the Nannadasi. We talked about how they had their own armies, their own flags, and operated across borders, sometimes rivaling the state itself in power.
The Veera Sasana showed they were incredibly powerful and proud of it.
Does it sound familiar? Huge multinational corporations operating across global borders, influencing governments, securing their own supply chains with their own security. Were the Nannadasi the Amazon or the East India Company of the 8th century?
That is a very provocative thought, and a very powerful one.
It makes you wonder if the tension between state power and corporate power is a modern invention, or if it's just history repeating itself. Maybe the leaders of the Nannadasi Guild would have felt right at home in the modern global economy.
Looking at the evidence, I think they would have been right at home. They understood that wealth is power, and power needs protection, whether from a king or a competitor.
Something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the kingdoms of the South.
It was a pleasure.
See you next time.